Hello, I'm the Daily Storyteller, and I'm here to keep you company today. If you've visited my channel before, welcome back. And if this is your first time, I'm so glad to welcome you to the world of stories. I know many of you use these videos to relax or to help fall asleep more easily. So get comfortable, let your body relax, and allow the gentle sound of rain in the background to wash away your stress and worries. In this video, you'll hear chilling stories, most of them based on true events, told with honesty and depth. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Now then, let's begin. Story: The Whispering Shadows. Real stories from the dark. I moved into the old house on Whitmore Street late last fall. It wasn't a grand house by any means, but it had a certain charm that drew me in. The exterior was weathered, the paint peeling away in places, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt a strange sense of comfort. It was a little too quiet, the air thick with dust and old memories, but I didn't mind. It felt like a fresh start, far from the noise of the city, where I could find peace. The house had been abandoned for years, and I was the first to rent it in quite some time. The landlord, a distant relative, had warned me that the house had a reputation, but he'd brushed it off with a smile and a wave. "Old houses have their quirks," he said. "It's nothing to worry about." And so I signed the lease, believing that it was all just superstition. The first few days were peaceful. I unpacked, cleaned the place, and explored every room, savoring the quiet solitude. The upstairs bedroom was my favorite. It had large windows that overlooked a small garden, and the sun filtered through the curtains in such a way that it seemed like the room was always bathed in warm, golden light. But despite how comfortable I felt, there was a part of me that couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off about the place. I would hear sounds in the night, creaks in the floorboards, the wind rattling the windows, the occasional distant thud. But none of it seemed out of the ordinary for an old house. However, as the days passed, the sounds grew more distinct, more deliberate. At first, it was a soft whispering, so faint that I thought I had imagined it. But then it came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Come closer," the voice would say. I would bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked around, the room would be empty, the air still. The first few times I brushed it off as the house settling or the wind playing tricks. But when it happened again, this time just as I was about to drift into sleep, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I sat up in bed, the darkness pressing down on me like a weight, and listened carefully. The whispering had become clearer, like someone was standing just outside my door, speaking in a hushed tone. "Come closer." I felt my stomach churn with dread. The voice was coming from the hallway just beyond the door. I stood, frozen for a moment, as the whispers continued. Slowly, almost against my will, I walked toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. The floorboards creaked underfoot, each step seeming to echo louder in the silence. I opened the door, expecting to find nothing but the empty hallway. But there, standing at the end of the corridor, was a figure. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, with no visible face, just a dark silhouette. The whispering stopped abruptly, but the presence remained heavy and oppressive. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, staring at the figure, willing myself to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The figure took a step forward, and in that instant, I felt an overwhelming sense of cold. It wasn't just a chill in the air, it was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, numbing you from the inside out. The figure didn't make a sound as it moved closer, its form shifting like smoke, merging with the darkness around it. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me, my heart racing in my chest. I leaned against it, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The presence, the figure, it was real. But what was it? I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, the result of too much stress. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with the house. The whispers were only the beginning. Someone was here with me. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and fear. I could no longer ignore the feeling that the house was alive with something unseen, something watching me. The whispers didn't stop. They became a constant presence, always there, just beyond the edge of my hearing, urging me to come closer. I would hear them when I was in the kitchen, when I was lying in bed, even when I was outside in the garden. No matter where I went, the whispers followed. Sometimes they were so soft that I thought I had imagined them, but other times they were so clear and distinct I could almost make out the words. They always said the same thing. Come closer. The figure in the hallway never appeared again, but I knew it was still there. I could feel its presence, lurking just beyond my sight, waiting. My nights became sleepless, filled with restless tossing and turning, the constant hum of the whispers driving me to the edge of madness. The house seemed to grow colder, more oppressive, as if it was feeding on my fear. One night, after another sleepless evening, I decided to confront whatever was haunting the house. I couldn't live like this anymore. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands trembling, and made my way down to the basement, the one place I hadn't dared to explore. The whispers seemed to grow louder the closer I got, as if urging me to turn back, to leave the house once and for all. But I couldn't. I had to know what was causing this. I reached the basement door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, the metal slick with condensation. The moment I opened it, the air rushed out, thick with the smell of mildew and rot. The basement was dark, the only light coming from my small flashlight, which flickered erratically as I stepped down into the darkness. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and walked deeper into the basement. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. "Come closer," they said, their voices so clear I could feel them inside my head. I reached the far corner of the basement where an old wooden chest sat against the wall. It looked ancient, the wood worn and cracked with age. The whispers seemed to be coming from inside it. With shaking hands, I opened the chest. What I found inside was not what I expected. There was no treasure, no ancient relics, only a pile of old, yellowed papers and a single broken mirror. The glass was cracked, the edges jagged, but the reflection that stared back at me was enough to freeze my blood. It was me, but not quite. The reflection was distorted, as if something dark and twisted was hiding just beneath the surface of the glass. It moved in a way that didn't match my own movements, its eyes dark and hollow, its smile wide and twisted. And then, in the silence of the basement, I heard the whisper once more, "You shouldn't have come here." Before I could react, the basement door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the dark with the thing in the mirror. Story. Voices from the abyss. Real encounters with the unknown. I had always been the type of person who prided myself on my skepticism. I didn't believe in the paranormal, in ghosts, in spirits, or any of the things that my friends would laugh about after a few drinks. For me, everything had a logical explanation. and there was always a scientific answer to be found. But that all changed the night I stayed at the old cabin in the woods. It was a last-minute decision, and I almost regretted it as soon as I arrived. My friend Brad had rented the cabin for the weekend, and he invited me to join him and a couple of others for a quiet retreat. I wasn't sure why I agreed. Perhaps I just needed a break from everything, or perhaps I thought the remote location would provide some peace and solitude. The cabin was exactly what I had expected, rustic, isolated, and a bit run down. It was located deep in the woods, far from any other houses, the road leading to it barely visible through the thick trees. When we arrived, I immediately noticed how quiet it was. There was no sound of cars, no distant hum of the city. Just the wind rustling through the trees and the distant sound of a stream. We spent the first day exploring the surrounding area, hiking through the woods and sitting by the stream, chatting about life and taking in the beauty of nature. But as the sun began to set, something changed. A coldness settled over the land, and the evening air seemed to carry a certain heaviness that made my skin crawl. That night, we gathered around the fireplace in the living room. Brad was already cracking open beers, and we were all laughing and talking about old memories when I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, suddenly tense. Brad looked at me with a raised eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "It sounded like a voice coming from outside," I said, standing up. "Like someone whispering. Probably just the wind," he shrugged, returning to his beer. "It happens out here in the woods." But I wasn't convinced. The whisper had been too distinct, too clear. I stepped toward the window, peering into the darkness beyond. The trees swayed gently in the wind, but nothing else moved. The whisper came again, this time louder. I turned back to the others. "I'm going outside to check." "Are you serious?" Brad asked, his voice half amused, half concerned. "It's pitch black out there." "What are you going to do?" "I'll be fine," I said, trying to sound confident, though my nerves were already starting to get the best of me. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, stepping outside into the cold night air. The cabin was quiet again, and for a moment I thought I had imagined the whisper. But then I heard it once more. "Help me!" I froze. The voice was clearer now, almost like it was coming from right behind me. It wasn't a normal whisper. It sounded urgent, desperate, and filled with fear. My breath caught in my throat as I turned around, but the woods were empty, the darkness swallowing everything in its path. There was no one there. The voice came again, louder this time, and it felt like it was inside my head. "Help me!" I stumbled back toward the cabin, my heart racing. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the forest itself was closing in on me. I slammed the door behind me, my hands shaking, and turned to face the others. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Brad and the others were staring at me, confusion on their faces. "Sure," Brad said with a forced smile. "You heard a voice in the woods. Maybe it's just someone else out here." But the more I thought about it, the more I was sure that wasn't the case. The voice hadn't been just any voice. It had felt wrong. It didn't belong here. It had been so real, so close, like someone was standing right beside me. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of unease lingered. The rest of the night passed in a haze of forced laughter and strained conversation, but I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone in the cabin. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows made my heart race, and the whispers, they didn't stop. They kept coming, just faint enough to make me question my sanity. The next day, I tried to brush off the previous night's events, chalking it up to the isolation and my own overactive imagination. But something was different. The air felt heavier, the woods seemed darker, and even Brad and the others were starting to act a little strange. They too seemed unsettled, though they tried to hide it with forced smiles and jokes. By evening, the whispers had grown louder, not just at night, but during the day as well. I would hear them when I was alone in the kitchen, or when I was walking through the woods. "Help me! Come closer!" The voice was insistent, becoming clearer and clearer with each passing hour. That night, things took a darker turn. We were all sitting in the living room when the lights suddenly flickered. At first, it was just a momentary glitch, but then it happened again. Longer, stronger this time. The room grew dim, the shadows in the corners stretching unnaturally long, and then the temperature dropped. It was freezing, the warmth of the fire doing nothing to combat the chill that had settled in. I could see my breath in the air, and the others seemed to notice it too. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. No one spoke. We were all too afraid to break the silence. And then we heard it. The voice, louder than ever before. "Help me!" it screamed, the sound of desperation unmistakable. But this time, it was no longer a whisper. It was a cry, a scream filled with pain and anguish, as though someone was pleading for their life. I jumped up from my seat, my heart racing. "What the hell is that?" I yelled, my voice breaking. Brad stood up too, his face pale. "We need to leave, now." But as we moved toward the door, something stopped us. The air thickened, the room became suffocating, and I felt a weight on my chest, as though something was pressing down on me, holding me in place. The whispers came again, this time surrounding us, coming from every direction, louder and more urgent. "Help me! Help me!" And then the voice spoke one last time, its words echoing in my mind, as clear as day. "You can never leave." The room suddenly went completely still. The voice, the whispers, the oppressive air, it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. We were left in silence, each of us staring at one another, too terrified to speak. What had just happened? Had it all been a figment of our imagination? Or had we truly encountered something from another world? We decided to leave immediately, packing our things and fleeing the cabin without another word. As we drove away, the woods seemed to close in behind us, the trees growing darker, the path growing narrower, until we were lost in the darkness. And yet, even now, years later, I still hear the whispers, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing night. "Help me! I don't think I will ever escape them." Story: The Haunted Forest. True tales of the lost souls. It was the end of September when my friends and I decided to take a weekend trip to the infamous Blackwood Forest. We had heard the stories, the whispered legends about the place, how people who ventured too far into the woods sometimes never came back, how the forest was haunted by spirits of those who had gotten lost and never found their way out. But we were young and invincible, eager for adventure, and not easily swayed by old tales. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sky overcast, casting long shadows over the dense forest as we unloaded our gear. The air smelled of wet leaves and earth, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees so thick it felt as if the sunlight was being swallowed up by the darkness. There was a strange stillness in the air, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The forest was known for its winding paths, treacherous terrain, and heavy mist that could disorient even the most seasoned hikers. But we were undeterred. After all, it was just a forest, right? A few hours of hiking, some light camping, and we'd be back before dark. Simple. As we made our way deeper into the woods, the path grew narrower, the trees towering higher around us. The sounds of the outside world faded away, replaced by the eerie silence of the forest. It was peaceful, but in an unsettling way. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves. We set up camp near a clearing, the perfect spot to enjoy the night away from the oppressive trees. The fire crackled and popped, and we sat around it, telling stories, laughing, and trying to forget the creeping unease that had settled over us. There was something about this place that felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be here. The sky darkened and the wind picked up, whistling through the trees. The firelight danced, casting long shadows around us. That was when we heard it, the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just one of my friends moving around, but when I looked around, everyone was sitting by the fire. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and it felt like someone, or something, was walking just beyond the edge of the light. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Everyone fell silent, straining to hear. There it was again, a soft crunch of leaves, like someone walking through the forest. But no one was there. "Probably just an animal," Brad said, trying to laugh it off. "It's just the wind." But I wasn't convinced. The footsteps were too deliberate, too close. They didn't sound like any animal I knew. "Maybe we should go back to the trail," I suggested, my voice shaky. "This place is giving me the creeps." But before anyone could respond, the footsteps stopped. The air grew colder, and the wind died down completely. The silence was suffocating. That was when we saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees, there was a figure standing still in the shadows. It was tall, its outline dark against the moonlight, but it didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone out there?" No answer. Just the cold, quiet night. I took a hesitant step forward, but then the figure moved. Slowly at first, like it was floating rather than walking. It glided from the shadows and into the moonlight, its face obscured by a hood. But there was something about it that made my blood run cold. It wasn't human. Its movements were unnaturally smooth, like it didn't have to follow the rules of gravity. As it stepped into the clearing, I could see its long, thin arms hanging by its sides, its hands stretched unnaturally long. And its face? There was no face. Just empty darkness where its features should have been. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. What are you?" I whispered, barely able to speak. The figure tilted its head as if studying me, and then it raised one long, slender finger toward the trees. It pointed slowly, deliberately. "Follow me," it whispered, the words like a soft breeze against my ear. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, locked in place, staring at the figure as it began to retreat into the forest, beckoning us to follow. I don't know why I followed it. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was something deeper, something in my gut telling me I had to go. had to know what this was. I don't even remember calling out to my friends, but somehow they were behind me, stepping cautiously, one by one, into the trees. The forest had changed. The air felt thicker, as though the very trees were alive, watching us. The path we had taken before was gone, replaced by a winding trail that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. The moon was barely visible through the thick canopy of leaves, and the shadows stretched farther, engulfing everything in darkness. We walked for what felt like hours, the figure always just ahead of us, leading us further into the woods. Its footsteps were silent, and every time we tried to get closer, it seemed to slip further away, just out of reach.
"Where are we going?"
Brad whispered, his voice breaking through the silence.
"Follow me,"
came the whisper again, softer now, like the wind itself was speaking. We pressed on, the feeling of dread building with every step. The trees grew darker, their trunks twisting and knotting into shapes that seemed almost human, as if they were reaching out to grab us. The air was heavy, suffocating, and I could feel something watching us, something in the woods that didn't want us there. And then, suddenly, the figure stopped. We found ourselves standing in front of a clearing, the trees around it twisted and blackened, their bark charred as though burned by some unnatural fire. At the center of the clearing stood an old stone monument, weathered and cracked, covered in moss and vines. It was inscribed with symbols I didn't recognize, ancient, cryptic, like they belonged to another world. The figure turned to face us, its hollow eyes staring at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, pressing in on me, suffocating me. "You should not have come here," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in the space around us. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to get out of the forest and away from this thing, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped in this nightmare. And then, without warning, the ground beneath our feet shifted. The monument began to tremble, the symbols glowing faintly with an eerie light. The trees around us creaked and groaned, their branches twisting like hands reaching toward us. "This is where they are trapped," the figure said, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "The lost souls, the ones who followed the call and never returned." I looked around, my heart racing, and then I saw them. At first, I thought they were shadows, but they weren't. They were people, figures draped in tattered clothing, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes empty, like they were lost in some endless, eternal void.
"You will join them,"
the figure whispered. "You will never leave." The ground beneath us began to crack open, and the lost souls reached out, their hands grasping at our feet, pulling us closer to the monument, closer to the darkness that lay beneath. I screamed, and for the first time I was able to move. I turned and ran, but the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees reaching out, the whispers growing louder, urging me to return. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the figure standing at the center of the clearing, its hollow eyes following me as I ran, its whispers echoing in my mind. "You will never escape the forest." Story: The Unseen Terror. Real horror stories that will chill you. I've always been the type of person who didn't believe in anything that couldn't be explained. Ghosts, demons, spirits. I thought they were all just figments of people's overactive imaginations. That was until I moved into the old apartment on 9th Street. It wasn't much to look at. The building was ancient, the paint chipped and peeling, with narrow hallways and creaky floors. The rent was affordable, and at the time, that's all that mattered. I needed somewhere to live after moving to the city, and this place seemed as good as any. At first, everything was fine. I moved in, unpacked my things, and got to work. The apartment was small, but cozy. One bedroom, a living room with a fireplace, and a small kitchen. I didn't mind the creaks and groans of the building. It felt lived in, comforting in a way. But then, a few days into my stay, strange things started to happen. I first noticed it one night, after I had returned from work. It was late, and I was exhausted. I tossed my keys on the kitchen counter and made my way into the living room to sit down. As I collapsed onto the couch, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The television, which I had turned off before leaving that morning, was on. It wasn't the static-filled screen you'd expect when a TV is left on without a signal. No, it was playing a channel I didn't recognize. The picture was fuzzy, and the sound was distorted, but there was a clear image. A woman standing in a dark room, staring straight ahead. I froze, staring at the screen. I had no idea how the TV had turned itself on. The remote was on the coffee table, and I hadn't touched it since I left. But the woman on the screen didn't look like a character from any show or movie I knew. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and hollow, and she stood motionless, as if waiting for something. I quickly turned off the TV and shook my head. I must have been imagining things. Maybe I'd left the TV on by accident. I dismissed it as a coincidence and went about my evening, but the unease lingered. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m., feeling oddly restless. The air in the room felt thick, as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. The apartment was silent, save for the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. But then I heard it, a soft, scratching sound. It was coming from the wall behind my bed. At first I thought it was the pipes, or maybe the building settling, but as the sound continued, it became more distinct, more deliberate. It sounded like someone was scratching at the wall from the other side. I got out of bed, my heart racing. I pressed my ear to the wall, but the scratching stopped. My mind raced with possibilities, but I couldn't explain what I had just heard. I moved back to bed, trying to calm myself, but sleep didn't come easy that night. The next few days were filled with similar occurrences. Strange noises in the middle of the night, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and objects in my apartment that were inexplicably moved. The worst part was that it was always just enough to make me question whether I was losing my mind or if something in the apartment was truly wrong. I began to hear the scratching again, but this time it was louder, more frantic. It wasn't just at night, it was happening during the day too. I would be in the kitchen, making coffee, and hear the unmistakable sound of nails scraping against the wall. I would go to investigate, only to find nothing but the peeling paint of the old plaster. One evening, after coming home from a long day at work, I decided to sit down and watch a movie to try and distract myself from the growing unease in the apartment. As I picked up the remote to turn on the TV, I froze. The television was already on. The screen flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw the woman again. The same pale figure with hollow eyes, standing motionless in that same dark room. But this time, her lips moved. "You're not alone," she whispered. The voice was soft, almost like a sigh, but it sent a chill down my spine. I immediately turned off the TV, my hands shaking. I couldn't explain it. I was terrified, yet I felt a strange compulsion to keep watching, to keep listening. But I forced myself to get up and leave the apartment, heading to a nearby park to clear my head. That night, as I sat on a bench in the park, trying to make sense of what was happening, I received a call from my friend, Mark. He had been one of the first people I'd told about the strange events, and I hadn't spoken to him in a few days. "I've been meaning to ask," he said, his voice sounding oddly distant. "How's the apartment?" "Have you seen anything unusual?" I was taken aback. "What do you mean? How did you know?" "I've heard rumors about that place," Mark said, his tone dropping lower. "People say it's haunted. The woman you're seeing on the TV, she's not just a figure, she's part of the building's history." I felt my heart race. "What do you mean? What history?" Mark hesitated before speaking. "There was a woman who lived in that building decades ago. She was murdered in the apartment, right in the room you're sleeping in. No one ever found the killer, and her spirit has been trapped there ever since." My stomach dropped as Mark continued to explain. "The thing is, they say she never left. People who've lived in that apartment over the years have reported hearing whispers, scratching, the feeling of someone watching them, but no one has ever stayed there long enough to figure out what's really going on. They always leave, convinced something's wrong." I stood up abruptly, my mind reeling. "Mark, I've been hearing those whispers. I've been hearing scratching, and I keep seeing her on the TV." "I can't explain it." "Get out of there," Mark said urgently. "You don't know what kind of things you're dealing with. It's not just a haunted house. It's something much darker." I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. The things Mark had said echoed in my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I knew I had to, but something kept me there. It was as if the apartment was pulling me back in, keeping me trapped. That night, things escalated. I came home to find the apartment colder than usual. The air was thick with something I couldn't identify. The TV was on again, playing static, but I didn't even need to look at the screen to know what was going to happen. I felt it before I saw it, the unmistakable presence of something in the room with me. The shadows in the corner of the room began to shift, dark figures forming just out of the corner of my eye. I turned to face them, but they disappeared as soon as I looked directly at them. The scratching was back too, this time louder than ever, coming from inside the walls. And then I saw her. The woman was standing in the middle of the room, her pale face barely visible in the dim light. She was motionless, just staring at me, her empty eyes locked onto mine. Her lips moved again, but this time the words were clear. "Leave, or I will take you with me." The voice wasn't hers. It was distorted, filled with malice, as if the apartment itself was speaking through her. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I could feel the temperature drop, the cold seeping into my bones, and I knew that I was no longer alone in the apartment. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness growing thicker, and I felt something reach out from the shadows, brushing against my skin. Without thinking, I ran. I ran as fast as I could, stumbling over the furniture, barely aware of what was happening. I slammed the door behind me, bolting it shut, but I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel her presence, feel the coldness of the apartment pulling at me, drawing me back inside. I didn't go back that night. I couldn't, but I can't escape her. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I can still hear her voice in the darkness. "Leave, or I will take you with me." And now, every night, as I lie in bed, I can hear the scratching, the whispers. I know she's waiting for me to come back, and I fear that one day I won't be able to escape. Story: Eyes in the Night. True paranormal experiences. It was the kind of night that felt like it would never end. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the quiet streets of our neighborhood. I had just moved into an old two-story house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a small place with chipped paint and a crooked fence. But it was mine. I was hoping that the change of scenery would give me some peace of mind after a rough year. At first, things were peaceful. The house was old, yes, but it had character. The creaks of the floorboards became familiar. The drafty windows added to the charm. There was a slight chill in the air, a feeling that the house had secrets to tell, but I didn't mind. I liked the solitude. I spent my evenings reading in the living room, the low hum of the refrigerator, the only sound that filled the silence. But that all changed one fateful night. It began subtly, as most strange things do. The first time I noticed something odd was on a Tuesday. I was sitting in the living room, absorbed in a book, when I felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching me. I looked around, but the room was empty. The curtains were drawn, and nothing moved. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing more than my imagination, and went back to reading. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a sound, a soft scraping noise that seemed to come from somewhere outside my room. At first I thought it was the wind or an animal, but as the noise continued, I began to feel uneasy. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was almost as if something was scraping against the window. I got out of bed and approached the window, my heart pounding. The curtains were closed, but I could see a faint shadow moving just outside. My breath caught in my throat. Was someone out there? I quickly pulled the curtains open, only to find the night empty, the lawn bathed in pale moonlight. I sighed in relief, but something still felt off. The air was thick, heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. The next few days were uneventful, but the sensation lingered. It was subtle, just a feeling that I wasn't alone in the house, but I couldn't explain it. Sometimes I'd hear faint whispers, like someone was speaking just beyond my reach, and occasionally I'd catch a glimpse of something moving in the corner of my eye. I thought I was just tired, that maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, that Friday night, everything changed. I woke up to a sound in the middle of the night. A soft thud, followed by the sound of something shifting on the floor. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, trying to orient myself. It was pitch dark, save for the faint light from the street lamp outside. I strained my ears, listening. The sound came again, this time closer, like something was moving in the hallway just outside my bedroom door. I got out of bed, cautiously stepping toward the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but before I could open it, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was definitely out there. I opened the door slowly, peering out into the hallway, but there was nothing. Just the dim, eerie glow of the moonlight seeping through the cracks in the walls. I stepped into the hallway, my body trembling, every instinct telling me to turn back, but my feet carried me forward. The house was eerily quiet, the floorboards creaking under my weight. I made my way down the stairs, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every step. The air was thick with something I couldn't explain. When I reached the living room, I froze. There, in the far corner of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Two eyes. Two glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. They were not human. They were large and round, with a pale, unnatural glow. They seemed to shimmer as though reflecting the light from the street lamp outside. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the intensity of the gaze. And then, slowly, the eyes blinked. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. I took a step back, my heart racing, and the eyes followed me, never blinking, never looking away. They were alive, watching me, waiting. I turned and ran back up the stairs, slamming my bedroom door shut behind me. I locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and huddled in the corner of my room, trying to catch my breath. The eyes never left my mind. They were still there in the dark, watching, waiting. I stayed awake the entire night, my back pressed against the door, my eyes darting toward the dark corners of the room. But the eyes never appeared again, ever. The next morning I woke up, exhausted, but relieved that the night had passed without any further incidents. I tried to shake off the terror I had felt, telling myself it was just a nightmare. But when I opened the door and stepped into the living room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The furniture had been moved. The couch, which I was certain had been in the corner of the room the night before, was now in the center of the room. The coffee table was tipped over, and the chairs were scattered across the floor. The room looked as though it had been ransacked, yet there was no sign of anyone having been there. I walked through the house, checking every room, but everything else was undisturbed. I couldn't explain what had happened, but the feeling of unease was overwhelming. It was as if someone had been in the house while I was asleep. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I sat up in bed, the room bathed in the dim light of my bedside lamp, listening for any sounds, any movement. The hours ticked by slowly, each minute stretching longer than the last. The house was still, but the air felt heavy, thick with the presence of something unseen. At around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the soft scrape of nails on wood. This time, it was coming from upstairs, from the attic. The same slow, deliberate sound, as if something was moving around up there. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and made my way up to the attic. The stairs creaked under my weight, the darkness in the attic swallowing up the light from my flashlight. I felt my pulse quicken as I reached the top, the air in the attic thick with dust and a strange coldness. I shone the flashlight around, my breath catching in my throat when I saw something at the far end of the attic. A figure, crouched down in the corner. It wasn't human. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs long and spindly. It had no face, just a blank, pale space where its features should have been. But its eyes, those eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, just like the ones I had seen before. The thing turned its head slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural. It locked eyes with me, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air was thick with terror, and the thing tilted its head, almost as if it were studying me, observing me. Then, without warning, it stood up, its body twisting in unnatural angles as it started moving toward me, its long, bony fingers outstretched. I turned and ran down the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest, my legs weak with fear. I ran out of the house, into the cold night, not looking back until I reached the safety of my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and drove away. I never went back to that house, and I never will. Story: The Cursed Path. Real stories of doomed journeys. It was a rainy afternoon when I found myself at the edge of the forest. I had driven for hours, winding through the misty roads, eager to find the secluded trail that had been recommended to me by a local. The path, they said, was beautiful, shrouded in mystery, surrounded by thick trees, and leading to an old, forgotten cemetery hidden deep in the woods. But what they didn't tell me, what they never mentioned, was the curse that had haunted the path for generations. I had been dealing with a lot of personal struggles lately, and the idea of hiking through the woods by myself seemed like the perfect escape. The thought of silence, of nature, was soothing. Little did I know that the journey would become a nightmare I would never forget. As I parked my car and stepped out into the damp, foggy air, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. The forest loomed before me, its trees towering like ancient sentinels, blocking out most of the light. The trailhead was just ahead, marked by an old weathered sign that read, "Cursed Path. Enter at your own risk." I laughed nervously at the warning. After all, who believed in curses anymore? I shrugged off the strange words, eager to start my hike. But the moment I stepped onto the path, I felt the change in the air. The temperature dropped, and a strange heaviness settled over me. It wasn't just the rain. It was something else, something older, darker. I continued walking, the trail winding deeper into the woods, the sound of my boots squelching in the mud the only noise that accompanied me. As I walked, the trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, clawing at the sky. The air grew thicker, the fog denser, and the further I went, the more disoriented I became. It felt like I was walking through a dream where time had no meaning. The further I walked, the more unsettling the forest became. There were no birds, no insects, just the heavy silence that seemed to weigh down everything around me. The only sound I could hear was my own breathing and the steady rhythm of my steps. As I rounded a bend in the path, I saw something up ahead. A figure, standing at the edge of the trail. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fog, but as I got closer, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair flowing wildly around her face as if she had been lost in the woods for years. She didn't move as I approached, her back to me. I called out, unsure if she had heard me. "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Are you lost?" The woman didn't respond. She remained motionless, her back still turned toward me. I took another step forward, but then, out of nowhere, a sharp gust of wind blew through the trees, knocking me off balance. I stumbled, grabbing onto a nearby tree for support, and when I looked back, the woman was gone. Vanished into the fog, as though she had never been there. I stood there, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I had no explanation for it. The woman hadn't even turned to look at me. And yet, the moment she had disappeared, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as though the very air around me had become charged with something dark and malevolent. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. The rain was falling harder now, and I had come too far to turn back. I pressed on, determined to reach the end of the trail and see what lay beyond. But the deeper I ventured into the woods, the more I felt as though I was being watched. Every step I took felt heavier, like something was following me just out of sight. And the whispers, those faint, eerie whispers, began again. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a low, mournful sound, like a chant echoing through the trees. I turned around, but there was nothing behind me. The trail was empty, just as it had been when I started. Still, the whispers grew louder, and I began to feel the oppressive weight of the forest pressing in on me. It was as though the trees themselves were alive, watching me, judging me for being there. As I walked further, I saw something ahead. The trees parted slightly to reveal a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a small stone monument, weathered and cracked with age. A forgotten memorial, surrounded by overgrown weeds and the remnants of old graves. The gravestones were worn down, their inscriptions barely readable. I walked closer, my feet dragging in the wet mud, and as I approached the monument, a sense of horror washed over me. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a sudden, eerie silence. My skin prickled as I stared at the monument. In the dim light, the inscriptions were just visible. They read, "Those who walk the cursed path will never leave." A chill ran down my spine. I took a step back, my heart racing. The wind began to pick up again, howling through the trees, and I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Soft, steady, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking behind me. I turned around, but the forest was empty. There was nothing there. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my breath quickening as the footsteps grew louder. I turned back to the monument, trying to calm myself, but when I looked again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The monument was no longer empty. At the base of the stone was a figure, a man, hunched over, his face obscured by the shadows. His clothes were ragged, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at me, his hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure remained motionless, its presence suffocating, as if the very air around it had grown thick and oppressive. The whispers returned, louder now, filling my head with their low, mournful chant. "You shouldn't have come here," they said, their voices rising in volume. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly lifted its arm, pointing directly at me. The moment its finger extended, a sharp pain shot through my chest, and I gasped, clutching my heart. It felt as if something had pierced me, a cold, sharp sensation that spread through my entire body. I stumbled backward, but the figure's gaze never left me. The air around me grew colder, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. The trees began to sway, and the shadows grew darker, stretching toward me like tendrils. I turned and ran, my breath ragged as I sprinted down the path, but the woods seemed to stretch on forever. The trail that had seemed so clear when I started was now a maze, twisting and turning in ways I couldn't understand. The trees closed in around me, blocking my way, and I felt the oppressive weight of the forest pressing down on me from all sides. The whispers followed me, relentless, growing louder, until they drowned out everything else. And all I could hear was one thing: "You will never leave." I don't remember how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning, and I had no idea if I was heading in the right direction. The forest had become a labyrinth, and I was lost in it, trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I looked around. The trees were no longer familiar. The clearing, the monument, it was gone. In its place was an endless expanse of dark woods. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the forest was completely silent. That's when I realized I had been walking in circles. And then I saw it, the figure standing just beyond the trees, watching me with its hollow eyes. It was waiting. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness closed in around me, and the last thing I felt was the cold touch of the shadows as they enveloped me. Story: The Silent Watcher. True stories of unsolved mysteries. I moved into the old apartment complex on Elm Street at the beginning of winter. It wasn't my first choice. The building had seen better days. The paint on the walls was chipped. The elevators creaked with every move, and the hallways always seemed a bit too dark, no matter how many lights were on. But the rent was cheap, and I was looking for something temporary while I settled into my new job. The first few days were quiet. I spent most of my time at work and only came home to sleep. It wasn't until my second week that I began to notice something strange. It started subtly. Small things that seemed insignificant at first, but after a while they piled up until I couldn't ignore them anymore. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't overpowering, but it was there, lingering in the hallways, a musty, damp odor that seemed to come from nowhere. I asked a neighbor about it, but they just shrugged and told me it was the building's age. Old buildings always have that smell, they said. But then I started hearing things. Footsteps. At first I thought it was just the creaking of the building settling. But over time I became convinced that I wasn't the only one in the hallways late at night. Every night, without fail, I would hear them. Footsteps that followed me as I walked to my apartment. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking just a few paces behind me, waiting. One night, I decided to confront whoever it was. I turned around as I heard the steps echoing behind me, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, just the distant sound of the old heating system humming through the walls. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just my imagination. But the next night, the footsteps returned, and this time I could feel them. Feel the presence of someone behind me, as if they were just out of sight. I rushed to my door, locked it behind me, and tried to forget about it. It didn't stop there. After the footsteps, I began to see something in the corner of my eye. Shadows that seemed to move in the hallway. Figures standing just beyond my line of vision, always at the edge of my peripheral sight. Whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. But the feeling was undeniable. Someone was watching me. I mentioned it to a few more neighbors, but they all had the same response. That's just how it is here. It's an old building full of history. Don't let it bother you. But it did bother me. A few days later, I decided to take action. I walked through the hallways, checking for any signs of life. The building was quiet. Too quiet. That's when I found it. At the far end of the hall, there was a door that had always been locked. I had never seen anyone go in or out of it, but that day, the door was ajar. My curiosity got the best of me, and I walked over to it, slowly pushing it open. The room was dark, the air heavy with dust. It looked like an old storage room, full of forgotten furniture and boxes stacked high. But as I stepped inside, something caught my eye. In the far corner of the room was a small chair, positioned directly in front of a cracked window. The chair was facing the wall, and something was written on the wall in faded, shaky letters. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something unsettling about it. Something about the chair being positioned there, facing the wall, made my stomach churn. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a low creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. The room was empty. I quickly left the room and closed the door behind me, my heart racing. Something about that chair, that room, It was as though someone had been waiting there for me, watching me, just as I had felt in the hallway. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to every creak and groan of the building. The footsteps, the shadows, everything felt too real to ignore. But I wasn't ready to leave, not yet. The next day I did some digging. I asked around about the building, about its history. What I learned sent chills down my spine. The apartment complex had once been home to a young woman named Clara. She had lived in apartment 3B, just 2 doors down from mine. No one knew much about her, but the stories said that she had been a quiet, solitary woman who kept to herself. That was, until one night she disappeared without a trace. There were rumors that Clara had been involved in something dark, something connected to the old building itself. They said she had been involved in an occult ritual, something that had gone horribly wrong. People claimed they had seen her sitting in the same chair, in the same room where I had found it, facing the wall. And then one night, she simply vanished. The police never found her. The investigation went cold, and the building was left to decay. But some people believed Clara's spirit never left. They believed she still roamed the hallways, watching, waiting for someone to come close enough to hear her whispers. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that something wasn't right in this building. It wasn't just the footsteps or the shadows. It was the feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that Clara was still here, that she was still watching me from somewhere in the building. It wasn't just paranoia. It felt real, too real. I started to feel like I was being drawn into something far darker than I had anticipated, something that I wasn't prepared for. The whispers started again, low at first, just faint murmurs in the distance. But as the days passed, they grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't go anywhere in the building without hearing them. They were always there, just beneath the surface, like an uninvited guest in my mind. "You're not safe here," they would say. "She's waiting for you." I tried to ignore it. I tried to continue my daily routine, to act like everything was fine, but the feeling of dread was always there. It followed me everywhere I went. And then one evening, as I was returning to my apartment after work, I saw it. The door to the room at the end of the hall was open again. I don't know why I went back. Maybe I was looking for answers, or maybe I just couldn't resist the pull of whatever was in that room. But I found myself standing at the threshold once more, staring into the darkness of the forgotten storage room. The chair was there, as I remembered it, still positioned in front of the cracked window. But this time it was different. The chair wasn't empty. There was someone sitting in it. The figure was slumped forward, their head hidden in their hands. They were wearing a long, dark coat, and their hair, long and dark, cascaded over their face, obscuring their features. I couldn't make out who they were, but the air around them felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't explain.
"Clara?"
I whispered, my voice barely a breath. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I heard it. The faintest whisper, like a breath in the silence. "Leave." The voice was weak, almost inaudible, but it sent a jolt of fear through my body. I reached out to touch the figure's shoulder, but before I could, they lifted their heads slowly, revealing their face. It was Clara. Her eyes were hollow, darkened with sorrow and despair, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening around us. And then, in that silence, I heard it, the sound of footsteps again, but this time they were behind me. Story. Through the veil, real ghostly encounters. It had been a long time since I'd visited my grandmother's house. It was a large, old Victorian home tucked away on a quiet street in a sleepy town. The house always felt alive with memories, and it was a place that held both comfort and fear for me in equal measure. It was where I had spent my childhood, playing in the gardens, exploring the dusty old rooms, and listening to my grandmother's endless stories about the house and its history. But after she passed away, I hadn't stepped foot in the place for over a decade. That was until I received a call one late autumn evening. The house was going to be sold, and there were a few personal belongings left for me to go through. So with a heavy heart, I drove back to the house, not knowing what to expect. The moment I arrived, I was hit with a wave of nostalgia. The house stood in front of me, just as it always had, with its tall windows and faded wooden exterior. The yard was overgrown, the garden that my grandmother had tended to so lovingly now wild and untamed. It looked as though time had continued on without us, as if the house itself had been waiting for someone to return. I walked up to the front door, the old brass knocker cool to the touch. It creaked as I lifted it and let it fall, the sound echoing through the empty house. When the door swung open, I was greeted by silence. The air inside was thick with dust, and the old smell of wood and leather filled my lungs. I stepped inside, my heart heavy with the weight of memories. As I made my way through the house, I noticed something strange. The temperature was colder than it should have been, even though it was still early fall. It felt like winter inside, the chill creeping into my bones. I told myself it was just the drafts in the old house, but there was something unnerving about it, like the cold wasn't just coming from the air. I went up to my grandmother's bedroom, which had been untouched for years. The bed was still made, the curtains drawn, but there was an overwhelming sense of something missing, like her presence had been taken away. I sat on the bed, taking in the room, the old rocking chair by the window, the bookshelves filled with well-worn books, the photographs on the walls. That's when I saw it. A small, delicate figure standing in the doorway. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me, but when I blinked, the figure was still there. It was a young woman dressed in a long white gown, her hair cascading down her back. She was looking directly at me, her face pale and expressionless. I couldn't see her eyes, but I felt them, felt her gaze piercing through me. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, but the figure didn't move, didn't speak. I took a cautious step toward her, but as I did, she disappeared into thin air, fading into the shadows like smoke. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it just a fleeting memory? I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched lingered, like something was waiting just beyond my reach. I left the room, but as I stepped into the hallway, I saw her again, this time standing at the top of the stairs, watching me from the darkness. I froze. My pulse raced, my breath shallow as I stared at the figure. She didn't move, but I could feel her presence, the weight of her gaze heavy on me. It was as though she was waiting for something.
Who are you?
I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer, but as I watched her, I felt something shift in the air, something cold and ancient that seemed to reach into my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was paralyzed by the intensity of her presence, and then, just like before, she vanished into thin air, leaving me standing there, trembling in the cold, empty house. The encounter left me shaken, but I told myself it was just a figment of my imagination. I was tired, stressed, and emotional from the whole process of cleaning out the house. But as the night wore on, the house grew colder, the silence more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That evening, I sat in the living room trying to sort through the old family photographs. The fire crackled in the fireplace, but the chill in the air refused to leave. I could feel the weight of the house, the weight of the years that had passed, the memories of everyone who had lived there. I tried to focus on the photos, but my mind kept drifting back to the figure I had seen earlier. And then I heard it, a faint sound, just on the edge of hearing, a soft whisper, like someone was speaking directly behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. My heart skipped a beat as I strained to listen. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it was unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, soft and melodic, like a lullaby, but the words were indistinct, as if they were being spoken underwater. I got up from the couch, my body trembling. The whisper seemed to be coming from upstairs, from my grandmother's room. I didn't want to go up there. I didn't want to face whatever this was, but the pull was too strong. I had to know. I climbed the stairs slowly, my feet heavy, each step feeling like it was leading me deeper into some unknown realm. When I reached the hallway, I saw it again. The figure. This time, she was standing in the doorway of my grandmother's room, her back to me. She didn't move, but I could feel her, feel the cold energy radiating from her. I stepped forward, my voice trembling. "Who are you? What do you want?" The woman didn't respond, but she slowly turned her head, revealing her face. Her features were ghostly, her skin pale and translucent, and her eyes were empty, hollow, like black holes. But it was the smile that struck me the most. It wasn't a warm, comforting smile. It was a twisted, hollow grin, as if she were trying to say something but couldn't. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The house was silent, the air thick with the same oppressive atmosphere. My heart was pounding in my chest as I turned back to the woman in the doorway. She was gone. The room was empty. I rushed to my grandmother's room, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and I froze. The air was thick, like something was pressing down on me, and the walls seemed to pulse with energy. I stumbled backward, my eyes darting around the room. And then I saw it. In the mirror on the wall, I saw her reflection. Only this time, she wasn't standing in the doorway. She was standing right behind me, her face inches from mine, her hollow eyes staring directly into mine. "You are not welcome here," the voice whispered. But it wasn't her voice. It was the voice of something darker, something ancient. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran from the room, out of the house, and into the cold night air. I never looked back. The wind howled in my ears, and the trees around me seemed to close in, but I didn't care. I had to get away. As I stood on the front lawn, gasping for breath, I looked up at the house one last time. The lights flickered in the windows, and for a brief moment, I saw her. She was standing in the window watching me. And then she was gone. I never went back to that house, and I never will. Story: The Darkness in the Hallway. True Tales of Fear. When I first moved into the old apartment on the 12th Street, I was looking for a fresh start. The apartment complex was cheap, located just far enough from the busy downtown to give me some peace, but still close enough to everything I needed. The building was an old 6-story structure with a brick facade and a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. It wasn't much, but it was all I could afford at the time. The first few days passed without incident. The apartment was small but comfortable. The creaky wooden floors, the cracked windows, and the dim lighting all seemed to add character to the place. I quickly settled in, unpacked my belongings, and began my routine. I was busy with work and spent most of my free time either reading or watching TV in the evenings. But there was something about the building that I couldn't shake. It felt off. There was a heaviness in the air, a strange sense of dread that clung to the walls. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as though I was being watched at all times, as though the building itself had its eyes on me. It was the hallway that unsettled me the most. The apartment doors lined the narrow corridor, and the flickering lights above cast long shadows that seemed to stretch far too far. The hallway was eerily silent, save for the occasional hum of the old heating system. Sometimes I'd hear sounds that I couldn't quite place. Footsteps behind me when I knew no one else was there. Whispers in the distance and the soft sound of something scraping against the floor. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home and noticed something strange. The hallway lights were off and the corridor was plunged into darkness. I thought nothing of it at first. Maybe someone had accidentally switched the lights off. But as I stepped into the hallway, I felt the air grow colder, as if something was lurking just out of sight. I reached for the light switch on the wall, but before I could flick it on, I heard something. It was a soft sound, faint at first, but it grew louder with every passing second. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. I froze. They were coming from the end of the hallway, the very end where the building's emergency exit door stood. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around, but no one was there. The footsteps continued, though, growing louder, as if someone was walking toward me from the farthest end of the hallway. I looked down at the floor, but all I saw were the shadows of the apartment doors stretching out in front of me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling in the silence. "Is someone there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. I stepped forward cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. As I walked, the temperature dropped, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was like something was waiting for me, hidden in the shadows of the hallway. My pulse quickened, but I had to know. I couldn't leave the hallway like this, not without knowing what had caused the noise. I reached the end of the hallway, the emergency exit door looming in front of me. The door was cracked open just slightly, the faintest sliver of light spilling through the gap. I pushed it open slowly, the door creaking in protest. There was nothing there. The room was empty, just a small storage area with a few old cleaning supplies and broken furniture. But as I stood there, the silence became suffocating, the air thick and heavy. That's when I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and just as I reached the door, I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the corridor, watching me. It was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and its face was obscured by shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze on me. I felt it deep in my bones. I slammed the door shut and ran back to my apartment, my hands trembling as I locked the door behind me. The sounds stopped as soon as I entered my apartment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, waiting. I spent the rest of the evening in a state of heightened anxiety. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It had to be a trick of the light, or my imagination, I told myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The figure I had seen in the hallway was real, And whatever it wasn't human. The next morning, I woke up late for work, and for the first time, I was grateful for the distraction. I barely thought about the events from the previous night as I went about my day, but when I returned to my apartment that evening, the unease returned. The hallway was dark again. The lights were out. I could hear the whispers this time, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere in the building. I told myself it was the pipes, the building settling, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct, until I could make out the words, "Come closer." I didn't want to. I didn't want to be anywhere near that hallway again, but my legs carried me toward it. Against my better judgment, I walked out into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers continued, growing louder with every step I took. "Come closer." I reached the end of the hall, and for a moment, everything fell silent. The air was still, as though the building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I looked down at the floor, and that's when I saw it. The same figure from the night before, standing at the far end of the corridor. But this time, it wasn't still. It was moving. It took one slow step toward me, then another, its footsteps echoing in the silence. The shadows seemed to stretch and warp around it, as though the figure was bending the very fabric of the hallway. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. My legs were frozen, my feet glued to the floor. The figure moved closer, its face still hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me. I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on me. "Come closer." The whisper was now right in my ear, as though the figure was standing just behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I bolted. I ran as fast as I could back into my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it, my heart pounding in my chest, and leaned against the door, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The building was silent again. The whispers had stopped. The footsteps were gone. But I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel the presence in the hallway, still feel the figure watching me. I moved out the next morning. I never looked back at that building. I couldn't. Story. The Forgotten One. True horror stories of lost souls. I had always heard stories about the old house at the end of Maple Street. The locals in the small town I grew up in whispered about it, and no one ever dared go near it. The house had been abandoned for decades, and its once grand facade was now covered in ivy and decay. It was said that the house was haunted, cursed even. People claimed to have seen strange figures in the windows, heard eerie sounds late at night, and some even said they felt something watching them from behind the cracked windows. But for me, the house was nothing more than a spooky story. Until one fateful evening when I found myself standing at its front door. I had just moved back to the town after years of living in the city. After my parents passed away, I inherited their house, which was just down the street from the abandoned mansion. Out of curiosity, I decided to walk by it one evening. The setting sun painted the sky with hues of orange and purple, and the town seemed calm, peaceful. But there was something about the house at the end of the street that called to me, something I couldn't ignore. I walked past it every day for weeks, each time glancing at its broken windows, the overgrown yard, and the door that was always slightly ajar. One evening, the temptation became too much, and before I knew it, I was standing at the foot of the steps leading up to the house. The door creaked open as if it had been waiting for me. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. The wooden floors groaned under my weight as I walked deeper into the house. I could feel the weight of the years pressing down on me. the history of the house lingering like a dark cloud. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper, and the furniture, though covered in dust sheets, still looked strangely out of place, like it had been frozen in time. As I explored the rooms, I found evidence of the house's former grandeur. There were old portraits on the walls, their subjects staring down at me with blank, lifeless eyes. The grand staircase at the center of the house, though now covered in cobwebs, still held an air of elegance. The grand chandelier, though shattered, still hung from the ceiling, casting fractured shadows on the walls. It was then that I noticed something strange. A door at the end of the hallway, one that seemed to be hidden from view. It wasn't there the last time I walked through, but somehow it was now open, just slightly cracked. I approached it, heart pounding in my chest. The door opened with a creak, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into what appeared to be a basement. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the best of me. I stepped down the stairs, the air growing colder with each step I took. The only sound was the echo of my footsteps on the wooden steps. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. The only light came from the flickering bulb above my head, casting long shadows across the walls. In the center of the room was a large, old-fashioned chest, its surface scratched and worn with age. The room itself was filled with old furniture and books, their pages yellowed and torn. It was then that I felt it, the sensation of being watched. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and slowly turned around. But there was no one there, just the silence of the room. And then I heard it, a soft whisper coming from the shadows. "Leave now." I spun around, my heart racing, but again there was no one there. The whisper echoed in my ears, filling my mind with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I turned back to the chest, my hands trembling, and opened it slowly. Inside was an old, dusty journal, its leather cover cracked and faded. I picked it up and began to read. The journal belonged to a woman named Eliza Blackwell, the last known resident of the house. As I read through the pages, I learned that Eliza had lived alone in the house for many years, until her sudden disappearance. According to the journal, she had been searching for something dark and powerful that had been buried in the house for generations. Her last entry was chilling. "I have found it. It's here, in the basement, and it calls to me. I hear it whispering my name, beckoning me to join it. But I cannot resist. I must." The words trailed off, and the rest of the page was blank. Suddenly, I heard the whisper again, this time louder, more urgent. "Leave now." I slammed the journal shut and ran up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was out of the house, standing on the front lawn, gasping for air. I looked back at the house, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure in the window, watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered after I left the house. I spent the next few days trying to forget about what I had discovered, but I couldn't. The image of the journal, of Eliza's desperate words, haunted me. I felt as though I had unlocked something that should have remained buried, something dark and dangerous that had been forgotten for a reason. The whispering never stopped. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, soft at first, then growing louder, calling to me. "Come back," it whispered. "You cannot leave now." I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger each day. Every time I walked by the house, I could feel its presence, as if something was reaching out from within, trying to pull me back inside. One evening, I couldn't take it any longer. The whispers were too strong, too persistent. I found myself standing in front of the house again, the door beckoning me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside, the darkness swallowing me as the door creaked shut behind me. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the floorboards groaned beneath my weight. I walked down the hallway, the whispers louder now, echoing in my mind. They seemed to be coming from all directions, surrounding me. "Come back." I reached the basement door, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. The stairs creaked as I descended into the darkness. The room was just as I remembered it, the chest still sitting in the center of the floor. But this time, there was something different about it. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and I could feel the weight of something ancient pressing down on me. I approached the chest, my hands shaking. When I opened it, the journal was gone. In its place was something darker, something far worse. A small, blackened box covered in strange symbols that seemed to move as I looked at them. The box was cold to the touch, and as I reached out to open it, I heard a voice, deep and guttural. "You shouldn't have come back." I slammed the box shut and backed away, my heart racing. The whispers intensified, surrounding me, and the temperature dropped, the room growing colder by the second. I felt something brush against my skin, something cold, like ice, and I turned to see a shadow move across the room. It was her, Eliza. Her face was pale and twisted, her eyes hollow, and her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. She reached out toward me, her hands cold and clammy, and I felt the pull of the darkness inside the room. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel my body being drawn toward her. "Join us," she whispered, her voice echoing in my ears. "You will never leave." I ran. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst through the door, stumbling out into the night, but the whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. When I reached the street, I looked back at the house, and for a brief moment I saw her in the window, watching me. I never went back to that house. But sometimes when the night is quiet and the wind is still, I can still hear the whispers. "You will never leave." Story. The cold touch. Real experiences of supernatural terror. I never believed in the supernatural. I was always the kind of person who dismissed stories about ghosts and spirits as mere fiction, stories people tell to explain the unexplainable. But that all changed one bitterly cold winter night when I moved into an old house on the outskirts of town. The house was beautiful in its own way, albeit a bit run down. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the floors creaked with every step. It was the kind of house that had character, though. It was also very affordable, which was important to me after my recent move. The previous owners had moved out due to personal reasons, but they didn't elaborate. I figured it was just another case of people wanting a change. Little did I know, the house had a history that would soon haunt me. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked my things and settled into my new home, the chill of winter creeping in through the cracks of the old windows. But there was one thing that stood out from the moment I arrived: the cold. Even with the heating running, the house never felt warm enough. The cold was suffocating, almost as though it was being held in place by something unseen. I tried to brush it off as the old house settling, but it wasn't just the temperature, it was the feeling. It was as though the house itself was alive, watching me, waiting for me to settle in. There were nights when I would lie in bed, wide awake, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. And then there were the whispers, soft at first, just barely audible. I would wake in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, convinced I had heard someone calling my name. But when I opened my eyes, there was no one there. I didn't want to acknowledge it. I told myself it was just the wind or my imagination running wild. But then things started to happen, things I couldn't explain. One evening, as I sat in the living room reading a book, I felt it. It started as a soft brush against my arm, a cold, icy touch, as though someone had lightly rested their fingers on my skin. I jerked my head to the side, expecting to see a draft, but there was nothing, just the empty room, dimly lit by the glow of the fireplace. My skin crawled. I stood up quickly, but the sensation of coldness didn't leave me. It lingered, wrapping itself around me like an invisible presence that refused to let go. The next few days were filled with more odd occurrences. I would hear footsteps in the hallway when I was alone in the house, faint creaks coming from the stairs or the door at the end of the hallway. The door, I noticed, was always slightly ajar, as if someone had just passed through. I would get up, walk over to close it, only to find it wide open again the next time I passed by. It was when I started seeing things that I couldn't explain that I began to realize the house was no longer just an old building. One night, after finishing dinner, I walked up to the second floor to retire for the evening. As I passed by the long, narrow hallway, I caught a glimpse of something, or someone, standing in the doorway of the spare bedroom. I froze. The figure was a silhouette against the moonlight, its form obscured by the dim light filtering through the window. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline of a person. I called out, thinking it was one of my neighbors or a friend, but there was no response. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, unmoving. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step toward the figure. I raised my hand, ready to say something, but before I could get any closer, the figure vanished. In a blink, it was gone, leaving nothing but empty space in the doorway. I rushed to the room, turned on the light, and checked every corner of the room. It was empty. No one was there. The house was silent again, but the cold, unmistakable chill that had followed me now seemed to have deepened, seeping into every corner of the room. I felt it pressing against me, smothering me. That night, I lay in bed, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. The house was still, but I could feel the weight of its presence around me. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, and no matter how much I tried to tell myself it was just my mind, I couldn't ignore the fear that had taken root inside me. I wasn't alone in that house. Something was there with me. The days that followed were filled with increasingly disturbing occurrences. The coldness in the house grew unbearable, and the whispers became clearer, more distinct. At times, I could hear faint laughter echoing through the walls, or the sound of someone gently tapping on the door, as if they were waiting for me to answer. But when I opened the door, there was nothing. One evening, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight, determined to figure out what was happening in the house. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand as I walked through the dark hallway, the shadows stretching long and ominous against the walls. I reached the attic door, which was locked tight the last time I checked. But tonight, it was different. The door was open. I stood frozen, staring at the attic entrance, my breath shallow. There was no logical explanation for it. I had never opened the door myself, and I knew I had locked it the last time I checked. But now it stood ajar, inviting me to step inside. With hesitation in my every movement, I stepped forward. The stairs creaked underfoot as I ascended into the attic, my flashlight casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. The air grew colder with every step, and the feeling of being watched intensified. My skin prickled with dread. The attic was small and cramped, filled with old furniture covered in dust sheets and cardboard boxes stacked in every corner. But it was the far corner of the attic that caught my attention. There, in the dim light, stood a tall old mirror, its frame darkened with age. It seemed out of place, as though it didn't belong. I walked toward the mirror, my feet dragging with the weight of the growing fear that I couldn't explain. As I stood before it, the reflection didn't seem right. The room in the mirror was darker than the one I was standing in, the shadows moving unnaturally. And then I saw it, a figure standing behind me. I spun around, but the attic was empty. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air. But when I turned back to the mirror, the figure was still there. It was a woman, her face obscured by long dark hair and her pale hands pressed against the glass as if she were trying to reach out to me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. The woman in the mirror began to move, her reflection bending and twisting unnaturally, and I could hear her breathing, slow and steady, as if she was right behind me. I could feel her too. The cold, icy fingers of her presence on the back of my neck, the air thick with something heavy and oppressive. I took a step back, my heart racing, but I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror. The woman's face slowly turned toward me, her eyes empty voids, hollow and dark, staring straight into my soul. She mouthed something silently, her lips moving, but I couldn't hear the words. I could feel her gaze, though, cold, judgmental, and condemning. Suddenly, the mirror shattered. The shards exploded outward, the sound deafening in the silent attic. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering wildly in my hand. The coldness was unbearable now, like it was seeping into my very bones, and I felt something inside me snap. I turned and ran, not caring where I went, only that I had to get out. I don't know how long I was running, but when I finally stopped, I found myself outside the house, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. The house loomed behind me, silent and still, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever I had felt in there, whatever had touched me, had watched me, was still there, waiting, and I knew with every fiber of my being that it wasn't going to let me go. Story, the dead whisper, true encounters with the afterlife. I had never been a believer in the supernatural. For years, I scoffed at ghost stories, dismissed haunted places as myths, and rolled my eyes whenever someone mentioned spirits. But everything changed the night I moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The house was a steal, too good to pass up. It was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, and the price was ridiculously low. I thought it would be the perfect place to start over after a painful breakup. It was quiet and peaceful, exactly what I needed to escape the noise of the city. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt something strange in the air. The house was large, with creaky floorboards and old wooden beams that seemed to groan under the weight of time. It wasn't just the house that felt old. It was as if the very walls held the memories of the people who had lived there long ago. The air felt thick, heavy with an unsettling presence. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. After all, every old house had its quirks. The first few nights were peaceful enough. I spent my days unpacking and setting up the house, and at night I'd retreat to the bedroom with a book or a movie. But by the end of the first week, I started hearing things. Little things at first, the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the halls when I knew no one was there. The creak of floorboards at the top of the stairs when I was alone in the living room. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was just the house settling. But then, one night, I heard something I couldn't explain. I had been reading a book in bed when I suddenly felt the temperature drop. A chill swept over the room, despite the fact that I had the heat on. The faintest whisper filled the air, so soft, so low, I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again, a voice, barely audible, but unmistakable.
Help me!
I froze. My heart raced as I scanned the room, looking for any sign of movement, any explanation for the voice. There was nothing. The room was still, empty. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild, or perhaps the house's old plumbing or wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. But the whisper came again, clearer this time, and this time I could make out the words.
Please, help me.
It was coming from somewhere in the house. The voice was soft, desperate, almost pleading. I got out of bed, my legs unsteady, my body trembling with fear. I opened the door to the hallway and listened intently, straining to hear anything beyond the normal creaks of the house. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps coming from downstairs, followed by a soft scratching noise like something or someone dragging across the floor. My breath caught in my throat, and I immediately backed away from the stairs. I knew I shouldn't investigate. I knew something wasn't right, but a strange, undeniable compulsion pulled me toward it. I couldn't explain it, but I had to know what was happening. I descended the stairs slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was eerily silent now, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I reached the bottom of the stairs and hesitated at the entrance to the living room. There, standing in the middle of the room, was a shadow. It wasn't solid, but a shifting dark mass that seemed to bend and warp as if it were made of smoke. It hovered there, its shape indistinct, but I could feel its presence pressing against the air, thickening the atmosphere. I couldn't move. I stood frozen, staring at the shadow. It was still for a moment, and then, slowly, it began to move toward me. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting until I could see my breath fogging in front of me. My entire body was trembling, but I couldn't bring myself to turn away, to leave. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as the shadow inched closer.
Please, help me.
The voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was loud, urgent, full of pain. Suddenly, the shadow lunged toward me, and I screamed, stumbling backward, my heart hammering in my chest. But the shadow stopped, hovering just inches from my face, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, the room was plunged into darkness. I couldn't see anything. The darkness was so thick, it felt as though it was suffocating me. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I reached out, blindly searching for the light switch, but I couldn't find it. The whispers filled the air again, louder now, frantic, as if the voice was desperate, begging for something. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the darkness lifted, and the shadow was gone. The lights flickered back on, and the house returned to its eerie stillness. I stood there, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I ran upstairs and locked myself in my room, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The whispering continued, soft and distant, but now I knew it wasn't just in my mind. someone was in that house with me. And I had no idea who or what it was. That night, I couldn't sleep. The voice of the spirit, the one that had whispered to me, begging for help, echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. The cold had returned, settling into every corner of the room, and I could hear faint noises from the hallway, scratching, dragging sounds, like something was moving around just outside my door. The next day, I went through the house again, trying to convince myself that I had imagined everything. I checked the doors, the windows, and even the attic, but there was nothing. The house was still, too still. I tried to get some answers from the local library, hoping to uncover more about the house's history, about the previous owners. But what I found only deepened the mystery. The house had been built in the late 1800s, and the original owners were a family named the Graysons. They had lived there for nearly 50 years before mysteriously disappearing in the 1920s. The town's records were vague, but one thing stood out. There had been rumors of strange occurrences in the house during the Graysons' time. Neighbors claimed to hear cries of anguish at night, and there were stories of a woman seen standing in the window, her face twisted in pain. The most disturbing part of the history, however, was the tragic tale of their daughter, Emily. She had vanished one stormy night, never to be seen again. The authorities searched the property for weeks, but found no trace of her. Some believed she had run away. Others suspected foul play, but no one ever found out what happened to her. As I dug deeper into the records, I realized that Emily Grayson's disappearance matched the whispers I had heard. Could it be her spirit that was haunting the house? Could she be the one who was reaching out to me? That night, I went back into the living room, determined to get to the bottom of this. I sat in the dark, waiting for something to happen, anything that could give me some answers. And then it came again. The voice. But this time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, clearer, as if Emily was standing right in front of me.
Help me!
I stood up, my heart racing, and I walked toward the staircase. As I reached the top, I saw it, her face, pale and distorted, pressed against the glass of the hallway window, her eyes hollow and empty.
Please, find me.
Her voice was filled with sorrow, pain, and desperation. I reached out toward her, but she vanished, leaving only the cold, empty air in her wake. And then the house went completely silent. I never heard from Emily again, but her presence never left me. I left the house shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that she was still there, waiting for someone to help her find peace. And every now and then, when the wind howls through the trees outside, I can still hear the faintest whisper, "Help me." I don't know if it was Emily's spirit or something else, but one thing is certain. The dead have a way of reaching out to those who are willing to listen. Story. Chased by Shadows. Real stories of paranormal pursuits. I had always considered myself a rational person, practical, grounded, and never one to fall for superstitions or ghost stories. But everything changed the day I moved into the old house on Sycamore Lane. It was a quiet, somewhat isolated place, far enough from the bustling city to provide me with peace and solitude, but not so remote that it felt unsafe. The house itself was quaint, the kind of place I thought would be the perfect retreat from the chaos of daily life. The moment I saw the "For Sale" sign out front, I knew it was the place I was looking for. The house was old, built in the early 1900s, with dark wood paneling, a winding staircase, and an attic that was half hidden behind a tattered door. The previous owners had left under mysterious circumstances, the neighbors told me. They never gave details, only that they'd left quickly and never returned to retrieve their belongings. The house had been empty for months before I arrived. At first, things were peaceful. I spent my days settling in, unpacking boxes, and enjoying the serenity that the house provided. There were strange creaks in the floorboards, of course, and the wind would howl through the gaps in the windows at night. But that was just the house settling. I thought nothing of it. But then something changed. It started small, little things that I chalked up to coincidence or my imagination. I'd be sitting on the couch reading a book and suddenly hear soft shuffling footsteps behind me. When I turned around, nothing was there. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the noises didn't stop. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear whispering voices, like a conversation happening just beyond the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, low, urgent, and filled with fear. It wasn't until one particular night, after I'd just gotten back from a long day at work, that things took a darker turn. I was standing in the kitchen, unpacking groceries, when I felt a sudden chill in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I turned toward the doorway leading to the hallway. A shadow passed by, quick and fleeting, just out of my line of sight. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't move for a moment, too paralyzed with fear to even call out. But then I gathered my courage and walked into the hallway. The house was silent again, eerily so. I checked every room, every corner, but found nothing. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The quiet was suffocating, the darkness pressing in around me, and then, from the corner of my room, I saw it. A shadow, tall, thin, and impossible to mistake. It was standing in the doorway, just out of reach of the dim light from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I stared, it grew clearer, more defined. The shadow was moving slowly, almost as if it were waiting for something. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, but before I could react, it was gone, vanishing into the darkness like smoke in the wind. I didn't sleep that night. The fear was overwhelming, and I kept thinking I saw movement in the corners of my eyes, the shape of something lingering just outside my vision. But every time I looked, nothing was there. The next day I called a friend to stay over with me. I needed someone else to be in the house, someone who could confirm that I wasn't just imagining things. They agreed, though they thought I was just being paranoid. That evening, we sat in the living room, watching a movie to distract ourselves from the oppressive silence of the house. But as the night wore on, things grew worse. The whispers began again, soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but growing louder, more distinct, until it felt like they were right next to us. I looked at my friend, who was pale and staring at the hallway, her hand gripping the armrest tightly. She heard it too. The whispers stopped abruptly, and then came the footsteps. The unmistakable sound of someone walking slowly down the hallway, their footsteps heavy, deliberate, and slow. I turned to my friend, my voice barely a whisper. "Did you hear that?" She nodded, her face drained of color. "Yes, and I don't want to hear it again." We both stood up, and I walked toward the hallway, my legs shaking with fear. As I reached the threshold, the footsteps stopped. The house was silent once more, but the air felt different. It was thicker, heavier, like something was waiting for us to make a move. And then, just as I was about to turn around and leave, I felt it. A hand, a cold, clammy hand, gripped my shoulder from behind. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I bolted out of the house and into the cold night, my friend right behind me. We didn't stop until we reached my car, and even then we just sat there, staring at the house in the rearview mirror, too afraid to go back inside. I couldn't stay there any longer. The next day, I decided to leave the house. I couldn't bring myself to spend another night there, not after everything that had happened. I packed my things quickly, not bothering to be thorough, and left without looking back. The drive to a hotel was a blur, my mind racing with the images of the shadow, the whispers, and the cold hand that had touched me. I stayed at the hotel for a few days, hoping that getting some distance from the house would help me forget. But it didn't. The feeling of being watched never left me. I couldn't shake the image of the shadow that had followed me, the sense of something pursuing me, something I couldn't outrun. It wasn't until a week later that I found out the truth. I went to the local library, hoping to learn more about the house and its history, thinking there might be some clue, some explanation for what had been happening. That's when I found the old town records, buried deep in a dusty archive. I began reading through the pages, and what I found made my blood run cold. The house had a long history of strange occurrences. The original owners, a family named the Mallorys, had lived there for decades, but one by one, they had disappeared. First the father, then the mother, and finally the two children. Each one had vanished without a trace, and the only thing left behind were the strange whispers and shadows that plagued the house. As I continued to read, I came across a name that sent a chill through me. Edward Mallory, the father of the family. He was known to have practiced occult rituals, and rumors said he had made a pact with something dark, something that had been waiting for him in the house. The pact was said to have bound his soul to the house, and with it, the souls of his family. It seemed that whatever he had summoned was still there, still waiting for someone to take its place. I knew then that I had made a grave mistake by staying in that house. The thing that haunted it was not just a ghost. It was something much darker, something that had followed me, something that would never let me go. That night, as I lay in bed in the hotel, I felt it again, the cold, suffocating presence, watching me from the darkness. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing in my ears, urging me to return to the house. "Come back," they whispered. I had no choice. I couldn't run anymore. I had to face whatever it was that had been chasing me. The next morning, I went back to the house. When I stepped inside, the air was thick with the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to move around me, and I could hear the whispers growing louder, filling my mind. I walked through the hallway, the footsteps following me, echoing behind me with every step. And then I saw it. The shadow, standing at the end of the hallway, watching me. This time, it wasn't just a figure. It was something darker, something that moved in and out of the shadows, shifting like smoke. It lunged at me, and I ran, not stopping until I was back outside. I didn't go back after that. The house was no longer just a place to live. It was a trap, a prison for the souls of the past, and I had been foolish enough to think I could escape it. But I knew now, there was no escaping the shadows. They would follow me wherever I went. Story, the vanishing, true scary stories that defy explanation. I'll never forget the first time I encountered something truly unexplainable. It was a late autumn evening when I arrived at the small, secluded town of Briarwood. I had heard stories about it, whispers of strange happenings and missing people, but like most, I shrugged it off as local legends. However, I never imagined I'd become part of that story. The town was picturesque, with quaint cobbled streets and old houses that seemed to have stood for centuries. The people were warm, though they seemed to keep to themselves, rarely venturing far from their homes. The townspeople would give me strange looks whenever I asked about the history of the place, quickly changing the subject. That only intrigued me further, and I decided to stay for a while to unravel the mysteries I sensed. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time exploring the town, soaking in the autumn colors, the chill in the air, and the rustic charm of the place. Everything seemed normal, but there was a strange undercurrent of unease, an unspoken tension in the air. Every time I passed the older houses, I noticed their windows were always shut tight, the curtains drawn as if to hide something from the world. One evening, as I was walking back to the inn where I was staying, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, something that made my stomach drop. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light, but as I turned to look, I saw a woman standing on the other side of the street. She was pale, her hair long and flowing in the breeze, but it was the way she stood that caught my attention. She was facing the old church at the end of the street, unmoving. Her back was to me, and the street was silent, save for the rustle of the wind through the trees. I don't know what compelled me, but I found myself walking toward her, my curiosity piqued. But just as I got within a few feet of her, she turned quickly, disappearing into the shadows of the alley between two old houses. I called out to her, but there was no response. The alley was empty. I looked around, confused, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had seen her. She was real, not a figment of my imagination. Yet she had vanished before my eyes. I asked a few people at the inn about her, but no one seemed to know who she was. No one had seen her. One elderly woman told me with a worried look in her eyes, "That's Sarah. She's been gone for years now." It turned out that Sarah was the daughter of the previous innkeeper, a young woman who had disappeared without a trace decades ago. They had never found her, and the town had accepted it as yet another mystery that was never meant to be solved. But as I stood there in the cold air, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's disappearance was tied to something far more sinister than just a missing persons case. The next day, as I was exploring the town further, I came across an old, dilapidated house at the edge of the town. It was abandoned, the windows boarded up and the front door hanging off its hinges. There was an air of desolation around it, and yet something about it drew me in. My instincts told me I shouldn't go inside, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed open the broken door, the hinges squealing in protest. The house was dark, and the musty air smelled of decay. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floor was covered in dust and broken furniture. The silence inside was oppressive, as if the house had been waiting for someone to enter. As I walked deeper into the house, I came across a room at the back. It was a bedroom, though it was barely recognizable as one. The bed was covered in cobwebs, and old furniture was overturned, but it was what I found in the corner that made my blood run cold. There, in the corner, was a small wooden box covered in dust and grime. I opened it cautiously, not knowing what I expected to find. Inside, there was an old photograph of a young woman, the same woman I had seen the night before. The photograph was of Sarah, standing in front of the old church, smiling, though her eyes looked distant, as if she wasn't fully there. But what struck me the most was the back of the photograph, where something was written in small, careful handwriting. "She is still here. Don't let her follow you. I felt my heart race, and a chill ran through me as I stood there, staring at the words. Who had written this? And why was it in this old, abandoned house? The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Suddenly, I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me. They were slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. But I wasn't alone. The footsteps didn't stop. I could still hear them, faint but undeniable, echoing through the old house. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the corner, glancing over my shoulder to check the hallway behind me. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. But the footsteps followed me, growing louder with every step I took. I turned to leave the room, but before I could reach the door, I saw her. The woman, Sarah. She was standing in the doorway, her long hair falling in front of her face, her eyes hollow and empty. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me with a blank expression. I froze, unable to look away. My breath caught in my throat, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply, sending a shiver through my body. I couldn't move, couldn't think. It was as if the room itself had frozen in time. Then, without warning, Sarah stepped forward, her feet gliding silently across the floor. She didn't make a sound, but I could feel her presence, an overwhelming sense of cold and despair that surrounded me like a shroud. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask her who she was, what she wanted, but no words came out. I couldn't form a sentence. I was paralyzed by the fear that gripped me, by the oppressive darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. Suddenly, Sarah's face twisted into a horrific grin, her eyes wide with something dark, something ancient. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing together as the shadows deepened, swallowing me whole. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, Sarah vanished. The room was empty again, the footsteps gone, the cold lifting, but the image of her twisted, vacant smile remained burned into my mind. I ran out of the house as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the safety of the town. The whispers followed me, faint but constant, like a low hum in the back of my mind. When I looked back, I could have sworn I saw Sarah's figure in the window, watching me, waiting. The town felt different now. It felt as though the very air around me had changed. The people, though friendly enough, seemed to know something I didn't. They avoided my gaze as though they were hiding something. I was no longer a stranger to them. I had become part of the town's cursed history, a history that no one ever spoke of. I never went back to the house, but I knew deep down that Sarah's spirit still lingered there, waiting for someone to take her place. The town was trapped in a cycle, caught between the living and the dead, and no one ever seemed to leave. As I drove away, I could still hear the faint whisper of Sarah's voice in my ear, a chilling reminder of the curse that had claimed her. You won't be the last. Story. The vanishing, true, scary stories that defy explanation. I moved to the quiet, remote town of Ravenville at the start of the summer. It seemed like the perfect place to escape the hustle of the city life. I was looking for peace, and Ravenville, with its picturesque streets and the endless rows of trees lining every corner, promised just that. The house I rented was a charming two-story cottage situated on the edge of town. It was old, but had been well kept over the years. The rent was incredibly cheap, and the landlady, an elderly woman named Mrs. Aldridge, was sweet but somewhat secretive. She warned me about the house, about the history of the place, but I didn't think much of it at the time. "Some things are best left alone," she said cryptically, but I chalked it up to superstition and dismissed it with a laugh. The first few weeks were blissfully quiet. I enjoyed the solitude, the long walks through the woods, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But as the days passed, I began to notice strange things happening around the house. It started with the small things. A chair that was always found in a different position than where I left it. Doors that creaked open in the middle of the night when I was sure I had locked them. And the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway when I was home alone. The first time I heard it, I thought it was just my imagination, but it became more frequent. I would hear footsteps walking through the hall at night, heavy and deliberate, as though someone was pacing back and forth. I decided to ask Mrs. Aldridge about it, but when I mentioned the strange occurrences, she became strangely quiet. She told me not to worry, that the house was just settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, as I sat reading a book in the living room, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps again. This time, they were louder, more persistent. I stood up, my heart racing, and walked down the hallway, my pulse quickening with each step. When I reached the stairs, I froze. There, at the top of the landing, stood a figure. It was a woman, or at least I thought it was. Her features were obscured by shadows, and she was standing perfectly still, staring down at me with an empty gaze. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, my breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at me with that hollow expression. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and I took a hesitant step back. That's when she moved. It was slow, deliberate. She took one step down, then another. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the urge to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. There was no sound, no movement. She was simply gone. I ran upstairs, checking every room, but there was no sign of anyone. The house was silent, and the fear that had gripped me seemed to dissipate, but only slightly. I knew what I had seen wasn't a figment of my imagination. Something was wrong with that house, and I wasn't the only one who had felt it. The next day, I decided to visit the local library and see what I could learn about the history of the house and the town. I dug through old newspapers and town records until I came across an article from the late 1800s mentioning a woman named Eleanor Blackwell, the previous owner of the house. According to the article, Eleanor had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a few personal belongings. There were no signs of a struggle, no explanation for her disappearance. She had simply disappeared. The article mentioned that people in the town had whispered about her disappearance, and some believed that Eleanor had been taken by something dark that lived in the house. The more I read, the more I realized that I had made a grave mistake in renting that house. That night, I went back to the house, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. The house was colder than usual, and as I stepped inside, the air felt thick with tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I walked through the darkened hallway, the faintest echo of footsteps following me, though I knew no one else was in the house. I reached the stairs again, my pulse quickening as I climbed them. The air grew colder with each step. When I reached the top, I paused. The door to the attic was slightly ajar. I hadn't been in the attic since moving in, and something about the door being open unsettled me. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The attic was dark, filled with old trunks, boxes, and forgotten relics from the past. But it was the far corner of the room that caught my attention. There in the corner was a small chair. It was facing the wall, just like the one I had seen the woman in before. My blood ran cold as I approached it. I reached out to touch the back of the chair, but before I could, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but when I turned back to the chair, it was gone. The room was empty again. I tried to remain calm, but the room was closing in on me, the walls feeling like they were pushing in. The air grew thicker, the temperature dropping, and I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I stayed rooted to the spot, my legs unwilling to move. That's when I heard it, the whispering. It was soft at first, almost like a breeze, but then it grew louder, more insistent. The voice was familiar now, the same one I had heard the night I first saw the woman. It was Eleanor's voice calling to me.
Help me,
the voice whispered, faint but unmistakable. I turned toward the door, but it was locked. Panic began to rise in my chest as I pounded on the door, desperate to escape. The whispers grew louder until they were no longer whispers, but shouts, urgent and frantic.
help me, get out!
I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it. The room began to spin, and the walls seemed to shift, twisting and bending around me. The chair reappeared, now positioned directly in front of me, but this time it wasn't empty. Eleanor was sitting in it, her face pale, her eyes empty and lifeless. She didn't speak. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with terror, as if she were trapped in the same nightmare I was. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the front door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, and I could feel the presence of something behind me, watching, waiting. The house was alive, and it was hungry. The whispers were everywhere now, filling my mind, drowning out everything else. They became a constant, overwhelming roar in my ears. Leave now, or you will never leave. I reached for the doorknob one last time, desperate to escape, and that's when the door creaked open. I didn't hesitate. I ran out into the night, the cold air biting at my skin as I sprinted away from the house, away from the whispers, away from the shadows that had been chasing me. As I looked back, I saw the light in the window flicker, Eleanor's face staring at me from the darkness. I never went back to the house, and I don't plan to. The town and the house are no longer just a part of my past. They've become a part of me, an indelible memory of a place that should have been left alone. The whispers still follow me sometimes, even now. And I know deep down that Eleanor is still there, waiting for someone else to answer her call. Help me.